We started messing around with cover crops back in 2008. And since then, we've tried a lot of different things. We've tried seeding cover crops in the spring, in the summer, and in the fall. We've tried a lot of different mixes, all the way from a monoculture of cereal rye, all the way up to a 12 and 13-way mix of brassicas, grasses, and legumes. And what we have found works best on our farm, which the majority is in a traditional corn and soybean rotation. What we have found that works best and most consistently is a cereal rye cover crop seeded directly after corn harvest. And as you can see, we're located in the southwest corner of Iowa here, south of Interstate 80. So we may have a few more options than some of the folks north of Interstate 80. And by we, I mean myself and my dad and one part-time employee. Farm about 750 acres here. I live with my wife and my 8 going on 9-year-old son. And over the years, we've each had our own opinions and philosophies about cover crops, and they've kind of evolved in different directions. But one thing that has kind of brought us together is a 6-word mantra that we have adopted on our farm, and that is, it all depends on the soil. And that could really be seen as a statement or an answer to questions, which is what we use it for in the spring when we're wondering, well, can we plant today? Well, it all depends on the soil. Is the corn harvest, is the corn ready to harvest? Well, it depends on the soil. So we really try to answer all of our questions with that 6-word mantra. But you can also see that my great-great-grandparents farmsteaded this area in the 1870s. And my our son was born in 2010, their great-great-great-grandson. So this soil here has literally supported our family for coming up on 150 years. So our family's welfare has depended on the soil. So I take water quality very seriously when it comes to our family. But you'll also notice that on the west side of our farm here is the West Nishnabotna River. And the West Nishnabotna River watershed has come under some more scrutiny over the last few years for their contribution to the Gulf hypoxia. So we're also very concerned about what we are contributing and downstream and for our neighbors near and far. So we really feel like taking care of the soil is what's going to help support both of those things. For myself, I returned to farm full-time in 1996. I spent 4 years in Des Moines getting a magazine journalism degree from Drake University and a year working there in Des Moines. I came back to farm full-time in 1996, and as I mentioned before, we are a mostly corn and soybean rotation. About 85% of our 750 acres are in that corn and soybean rotation. But we do have some pasture here and some alfalfa here, along with about a 25 or 30 head cow-calf operation, and just are getting interested in some goats to try to complement those cows. And in 1998, we went 100% no-till. And as you can see from this picture that was taken a few years ago, we farm mostly flat, poorly drained soil. But in areas like this, you can see tend to stay wet. We do not have any tile on our farm. And in 1998, when we went no-till, we started getting away from using the disc and the field cultivator and the deep ripper and the chisel plow. I still have very vivid, not so fond memories of heading out to this field with a disc and making a circle around that wet spot, waiting for that part to dry, coming back a day later, shrinking that circle a little bit. And by the time we got that wet spot tilled, it was basically a cloddy mess. And I kind of just, there really wasn't anything going to grow in there anyway. And I always felt like we were just torturing that soil with those implements. So we did go 100% no-till in 1998. And at that time, I subscribed to No Till Farmer magazine and started reading about this thing called cover cropping. Guys out east were doing it a lot and got really interested in it. So in 2008, we happened to be driving by a Case IH dealer, and sitting out front was the deal of the week. It was a well-used 1995 15-foot Great Plains no-till drill, and kind of on impulse, we bought it. And as it turns out, that was one of the best $6,500 we've ever spent. We're actually still using that drill to this day. It's had some rebuilding to it, but it's been a good machine. and that really got us into cover cropping. We were able to jump in. And then in 2015, as I mentioned, we had been experimenting with a lot of different cover cropping methods, timing, seeding rates, seed mixes, and we decided that if we're going to see any improvement, any benefit from our cover crop, we're going to have to get away from the 5 acres here and the 15 acres there and really commit to doing this on a larger scale year after year. So in 2015, we committed to planting every acre of our harvested corn acres to cover crops every fall. And that amounts to about 300 or 330 acres of cover crop after corn. And then in 2017, we got interested in this idea of precision seeding cover crops. And I'll go into a little bit more about our journey on that here in just a little bit. But before I get too far, I want to make sure we're on the same page when it comes to what precision seeded means to me, and also what a cover crop means to me. And when it comes to precision seeding, we have tried to frame most of our enterprises on our farm with the 4 R's, and that's the right product at the right time, at the right rate, in the right place. So by the right product and the right time, we've already pretty much taken care of that in this context. The right product being cereal rye, and the right time being fall. I should say, with that right time, we did do a PFI field trial called accommodating cover crops, accommodating cover crops with early seeded corn and soybeans. So in an effort to better get our cover crops seeded in the fall, get it planted at the right time, we have shrunk the relative maturity of both our corn and our soybeans. So that's been one of our efforts to try to meet one of the 4 R's in this instance. But tonight I'm going to focus mainly on the right rate and the right place. Really, while this could be limited to just the planter, I also mean by that in the field as well, not only in the seed trench, but in the field geographically as well. And when I'm talking about cover crops, in this instance, again, I'm talking about cereal rye, and in this instance, early a variety, Eldon rye, it's a southern variety that really gets a good early jump in the spring. Because this is what I fully expect our cover crop to look like early May when we're planting soybeans. We seeded this cereal rye early the previous fall, and actually grazed it over the winter and pulled cows off in early March. And you can see that it really took off growing after that, even after that grazing pressure. Caveat being we had a really long fall and a really mild winter. So we won't get this every time, but this is what we're shooting for the majority of the time. This is probably about 5 or 6 tons of biomass, and that really does wonders for our soil quality, but it also unexpectedly has really become part of our herbicide program. So tonight I'm going to talk about 3 main points, kind of our journey from how we got from that well-used 15-foot Great Plains drill to using our 30-foot 12 or 23 row Kinsey interplant. How we have that planter set up, and some of the pros and cons of using that system. And really the journey it really was started from 2 main kind of kicks, I guess, if you will. The first was the 4 R's, as I'd mentioned before. And the second was very simply soil disturbance. And last fall, we planted this area here. We're doing a test plot for the Iowa Soybean Association using our planter for this precision seeding. This is what I like to see our ground look like in the spring when we plant corn in a soybean stubble. If you're just happen to be driving by on this road over here, I don't want the casual observer to tell that this has been planted at all. This is the soil disturbance that I'm after. And just for kicks and giggles, after I seeded that with the planter, I went ahead and ran a drill pass here. And you can see that that's pretty much amounts to a light tillage pass. So if that fall seeded cover crop doesn't get off to a real fast start, basically we're going to have more soil exposed over the winter than if we had done nothing at all. And even here we go, 3 weeks later, still a pretty stark difference. And then earlier this year, I snapped a picture before we got the majority of our snow. And this picture isn't quite as fair as comparison. The lighting in these two pictures are, of course, very cloudy. And the lighting here is low in the western sky. So it really highlights the ridges here and how long that soil has been exposed to the elements, to erosion, to that type of thing. And next spring when that snow melts off, it's going to be a muddy, mucky mess. And you can see some of the green roads of cereal rye coming up here. It was a fall for getting up last fall. So this is, thought I'd talk a little bit too about how we have our planter set up. And I should mention quickly for those of you that don't know about the Kinsey interplant, it's called a 1223 because there are 12 rows in the back and 11 rows in the front. And these front rows can actually be lifted out of the ground to give you 12 30-inch rows in the back, which is how we plant corn. And then you can lower the row units in the front to give you 15-inch rows, which is how we plant our soybeans and now our cereal rye. So our planter is all mechanical. It's ground driven with this wheel here. The chains take care of the transfer of power. There's no, it's not an air seeder. Everything is mechanical. We do have some row shutoffs, but other than that, everything is ground driven. And you can tell by this picture down here from this picture of the row unit that we don't have any no-till attachments. The planter that we had prior to this was also a Kinsey earlier model, and I had just about every no-till attachment hanging off there that you could imagine. Had the Martin floating row cleaners in the front, had the spiked closing wheels back here with the drag chain following that, and one by one I started taking those off and getting along just as well, or maybe even better, than we had with those attachments. Gabe Brown has said that a marker arm is too much tillage for him, and I tend to agree with him, especially when it came to those Martin floating row cleaners. Anywhere where we had pushed that residue out of the way, there were weeds coming up just as fast as the cash crop. So we don't have any no-till attachments on this planter at all, and that's the way I like it. Also, as far as settings go, we have almost everything on the lightest or the next to the lightest setting. So the down pressure springs here on the next to the lightest setting. You can see the closing wheels here are on the lightest setting. It's real, I want everything to be real gentle when we go through that field. And this planter does a great job at achieving that while getting that cereal rye seed placed at about 2 inches deep. And as far as as far as the second factor of placement, we have the placement of the seed in the seed trench. But as far as placement in the field, I do like the RTK GPS. Obviously, if we're not using marker arms, we're going to have some way to guide us through the field. I really like using that RTK, especially if you don't get your field finished and you come back the next day, there's not a lot of wander there can be with GPS. But as I mentioned prior, we've really come to rely on our cover crop in the spring for weed control. So we need to make sure that every square foot of that field is planted to a cover crop. And where there's a gap, we're for sure going to have weeds popping up through that gap. And then finally, this planter does have the brush type meters. This is a close-up view of that brush type meter. And really all it takes to convert this planter into a cereal rye seeder is to slap on a backing plate. And that essentially makes these holes just a little bit smaller to allow for a more restricted flow of that cereal rye. Excuse me. So this is kind of a close-up of that setup. These backing plates we borrowed from the Iowa Soybean Association. They're a fairly thin, rigid metal with a gasket glued around the outside here. And I included a little video here. We'll see if it works. It really is a simple process. It doesn't take long to convert that planter from a soybean planter to a cover crop planter. And I included these pictures down here from seedright.com. This plate on the far left here is the equivalent of this plate up here. They list their prices starting at $31. So really, it's not a price prohibitive way to get into cover crops, especially precision seeding cover crops. And the rest of these plates here are just different iterations for different planters, different seeds to flow through there. You'd think after so many times of putting these meters in, we'd know how to put them in. It took a little bit to get that in right, but that's all there is to it. You put that back on your planter and you're ready to go. I wanted to include this slide. It's not exactly planter setup, but I feel like it's a very important part of our um, uh, cover crop planting system, and that is this bulk fill system. We figured that if we're seeding 300 acres of cereal rye at 55 pounds, that's about 330 50-pound bags, and hucking those around and filling each row hopper unit with that seed can get tiring very fast. Or we can buy the 8 bulk bags, about a ton each, of the cereal rye, dump 3 bags in here, and this little apparatus is called a Brun pneumatic seed handler. It literally sucks the seed out of the wagon, dumps it into here, and blows it out through this tube. And that really makes filling, whether it's the drill or the planter, it really makes it less labor intensive. So depending on how this Briggs and Stratton engine is behaving, that's really the weakest part of the whole system. Depending on how it's behaving, we can get that planter filled in about 20 minutes. So again, it sure beats carrying those 50-pound bags around. So as far as some of the pros and cons with using this system, as I mentioned prior, the main pro for this is really meeting those 4 R's, getting the rate and the placement down to a science. Really, we've started to treat cover crops as important as our cash crops. So we wouldn't be out there broadcasting our beans or our corn. So I don't feel like we should be broadcasting our cereal rye either, and hoping that for rain to kickstart it. As I mentioned before, the soil disturbance is a huge pro. Another pro with this, of course, is you don't necessarily need a drill. You don't need another piece of equipment. All you need to do is invest your $30 per row unit for the backing plates. I have heard of some guys that will buy the sheet, that thinner, rigid metal, take it to their blacksmith, who will then cut out the circles for them. They'll buy the gasket themselves, glue it on, and put it on. They've got a cheaper backing plate than what they could buy. And of course, the precision-ish seeding, and I'll address this ish here in the cons. But the precision seeding really is the main benefit of this setup. I really like knowing that every one of those cereal rice seeds is planted 2 inches deep. It's getting covered effectively with those closing wheels, and is all going to come up nice and evenly, and grow evenly over winter evenly, and give us nice even control of the mix. And then finally, obviously, a 30-foot planter is going to be much faster than a 15-foot drill. We can plant about 20 acres an hour with this setup, and I think we could probably eke out 21 or 22 acres an hour with that, as long as the ground is relatively smooth, especially if we're planting into soybean stubble. On the direct flip side of that, of course, is the cost per acre. Iowa State University has some nifty spreadsheets that you can enter in your variable inputs, what kind of tractor you're using, what kind of implement you're using, and it'll spit back your cost per acre. And the cost per acre with using this interplant with our tractor is about double the rate as it is for using the 15-foot drill. Obviously, that 15-foot drill takes a smaller tractor, which we pull with a 125 horsepower tractor, and this planter takes a bigger 180 horsepower tractor. So the cost per acre could potentially be a con. We have this problem with seeding rate gaps with corn and beans also. As I mentioned earlier, this planter is all ground driven and mechanical, and the population rate is changed with different combinations of sprockets. So there's going to be seeding rate gaps in your planting population potentially. if you are seeding your cereal rye at 40 pounds to the acre and you want to seed 44, chances are that's not going to happen. Uh, there's probably going to be a gap there. And so if you're, excuse me, if you're very picky about getting the exact seeding rate in there, that could potentially be a problem for you. And also, if you noticed on the left side here, I included this picture of the monitor because we should be dropping about 1 million seeds per acre here, but our stock row tube sensors can't sense that many seeds, so it's showing that we're seeding about half rate, which we know wasn't true. And that's another potential con. I mean, really, we're used to referring to seeding cereal rye in pounds per acre, and really we should be referring to it with seeds per acre, but it's going to take the technology a little while to catch up to be able to sense 1 million plus seeds per acre. So that's another potential con. Uh, and as far as seeding multiple species, that's kind of an unknown. We haven't tried it yet. I want to try seeding cereal rye with rapeseed and hairy vetch. Obviously, those two seeds are much smaller than a cereal rye seed, so we shouldn't have any trouble with those flowing through. But anything that's bigger than that cereal rye is going to have trouble coming through that backing plate modified type seed. So if we're looking to seed a lot of species through this mix, that could potentially be an issue. And then finally, the 15 or 30-inch row spacing could potentially be a con. I put an asterisk by that. As I mentioned before, the test plot that we're doing for Iowa Soybean Association, we've done in both 30 and 15-inch rows with the idea of coming back and planting corn in between the rows. And I have seen in the year that we've done it, and this will be the second year coming up, pretty decent weed control with those 15-inch rows. So if we could if we could double our seeding rate, our acres per hour, I could see my way clear to seeding in 15-inch rows. So that could be a potential offset there, that perhaps 15-inch rows aren't as bad as I once thought. I always liked the drill spacing at about 8 inches because I like how fast it canopies, I like how fast it covers the soil surface, and I like how it outcompetes those weeds. But we are seeing similar performance from a 15-inch row spacing from this particular set. I want to include this picture in the middle here because that's sort of the antithesis of precision seeding. That's where I spilled some cereal rice seed on the driveway when I was filling the drill. It rained quite a lot after I had spilled that. Of course, the cereal rye grew. There aren't many places that cereal rye won't grow. It is the king of cover crops for good reason. But that's not how we would seed our beans, and that's not how we would seed our corn. Um, if we refer back to our 4 R's, that's not the right rate, and it's not really the right place either. And so really this is kind of the antithesis of what we're after. We are after something that we can get consistently year after year seeded in a timely fashion. And that's again kind of speaks back to that increased rate of planting. We have seen some pretty good success with getting obviously more acres covered with that Kinsey planter than with the drill. And I wanted to include these other two pictures here because I really do love, it kind of circles around to why I love cover crops so much. Obviously, I mentioned that this soil has supported our family for a long time, and I feel like taking responsibility for our neighbors downstream. When you drive by this field on the left here at 55 miles an hour, you may look out across here and think, cover crops at work. Well, whatever, there's nothing at work out there. Look at that picture on the end of that particular month. You can see 9 days later that snow melted off and it revealed an absolutely beautifully green carpet of cereal rye. And you know at that point that, yeah, that cover crop has been working even under that snow. Obviously, we have great soil surface coverage here, but more than that, we know that there are living roots in this soil in November, which is fairly uncommon in a traditional corn and soybean rotation not using cover crops. So you know that those roots are feeding our flora and our fauna, feeding our soil livestock, um, getting the fungi fed and revved up and ready to feed the subsequent cash crop that we're going to be planting in here, soybeans, in May. So when someone who's driven by this field on this road up here asks us next spring, well, you know, how did your soybean planting go? How did your soybean crop look during the summer? What were your yields like in the fall? You know that we will answer them with our 6-word mantra, and that is, it really does all depend on the soil.
Excellent. Thank you, Jon. Yeah, if anybody's got some questions for Jon as we switch over to Michael, feel free to put them in that chat box. Yeah, Jon, your volume got a little low at the end of that. But I was able to catch it. I hope everybody else was too.
Okay, good. I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit.
Well, I don't know if the microphone was adjusted or if or anything like that, but
okay.
Anyways, yeah, so we've, Michael, if you want to pull up your presentation, you're welcome to do that now, and we can give it a minute to see if anybody's got a question for Jon that they get in the chat box while we do this transition.
Are we live?
Yeah, sure are. I can see your presentation coming up. Looks
All right.
like, there we go, full screen. Just to be fair, I don't know if if anybody started typing a question, I probably haven't given them enough time to finish typing. So we'll just give it another second here to see. We should have time after Michael is done, though, to ask questions for both Jon and Michael. Jon's going to stick around, obviously, so we'll have time for questions for both of them. All right. Well, Michael, yeah, I'd say it's all yours. Go ahead.
All righty. Thank you. Yeah, as he said, my name is Michael Vittetoe. I'm a farmer in southeast Iowa in Washington County. You can see some of my contact info here on the slide. That'll be back up at the end of the presentation again. But here's some of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to start off with a quick introduction to our farm operation. Cover a quick little cover crops 101 basic stuff. Then we'll talk about some of our equipment that we're using, and then we'll get into our twin row rye, interceding, and some outside the box ideas on precision cover crops. Okay, so the introduction to our operation, we're a multi-generation family farm. We operate about 1,400 acres, as I said, in Washington County, in southeast corner of the state. Our cash crops are corn and soybeans. My dad and grandpa started no-tilling back in the 80s, so we've been no-tilling for over 30 years. And we've been using cover crops for about 5 or 6 years. And our cover crop species that we're using is primarily cereal rye, but we're also playing around with some diverse mixes where we're interseeding into corn. And then we also have some livestock. We primarily are confinement swine on our operation. We've got 4 finisher buildings and two nursery buildings that we contract grow for a farmer in the area. And then I've also started building a cattle herd in the last year. So I'm doing grass-fed beef and playing around with some direct marketing on that. So that's all still in its infancy, but kind of the new thing that I've got going on, keeping me busy. So now to get into cover crops 101, you know, we're going to be focusing mainly on cereal rye tonight. So I just wanted to kind of hit some key points on it. You know, it's the most popular cover crop in the Midwest. It's a cool season grass. It's super winter hardy, has a great root system. It's very supportive of the soil biology, the fungi, and everything in the soil. You know, it creates the associations that we want to be creating with those soil livestock. And with the great root system, it's good at erosion control. So we're using it on our more hilly ground, anywhere we've got C and D slopes. We are putting cereal rye out there every year. It's a good nutrient scavenger, which is great for our water quality initiatives that we have going on. It loves nitrogen, so it's going to hunt it down and take it up anywhere it can. And as Jon showed, with his driveway picture, it's easy to establish. I've definitely had some cereal rye patches growing in our driveways where I tender the drill, so I can relate to that one. And then it's also good for grazing if you've got cattle. I know Jon talked about that a little bit, and I was able to get some experience doing some cereal rye grazing this spring with my few head of cattle. Okay, so now let's talk about precision cover crops. In my mind, precision cover crops are just cover crops that are seeded with, a precision GPS auto steer system and using the same guidance line as the following cash crop. I think that's important. And the reason that we're doing that is we want to provide some separation between our cover crop rows, our rye, and the following cash crop rows. So typically precision cover crops are going to be seeded using a drill or a planter, but it could also be done with another tool such like a air seeder with a drop to create a narrow band of your cover crop. And most common, most of what I've seen people playing around with is the twin row stuff. I know people like Jon are using the planters, so then you can get into some 15s and some 30-inch row configurations. But yeah, precision cover crops is not aerial seeded or wide swath broadcast applications. That's not that those are necessarily a bad thing, but that's not precision cover cropping. That's just broadcast. So here's some of our equipment. The previous setup that we've been using is this John Deere 750 drill. It's set up on twin rows here in these pictures, and we set it up on twins to interseed into corn, and then we just kept it on twins to play around with our twin row rye going into corn, ahead of corn, I should say, back in 2016, and then we used it again in 2017. For us, this wasn't going to work well ahead of soybeans because we're twin row soybeans, and in order to get the row units to work properly, we would have had to run the drill row units between the corn rows, and then we would have had twin row beans directly into twin row rye, and there would have been no separation of the cash crop and cover crop like what we're looking for. So in order to do cereal rye ahead of soybeans, I had to do a mid-harvest row unit shuffle and move all of the row units about 4 inches. So you can see right here on the front toolbar, there's a piece of tape. That's where this row unit was placed for the twin rows. So I had to shift it left there about 4 inches. And then the next year I had to take it back for interseeding and whatnot. So that was a pain in the butt to be doing in the middle of harvest when you got a million other things going on. But that's what we did the last 2 years. To be able to drill rye in front of the soybeans into corn stalks. Another problem is I didn't want to be doing that back and forth every time I wanted to switch between bean stubble and corn stalks. So I went and drilled all of our bean stubble first and then did all of our corn stalks last. So it just kind of created some logistical issues as far as that was concerned. And then it didn't leave much wiggle room for our twin row beans. You look between these rye rows and between the corn stalks, there's not a whole lot of room to run 2 planter row units down that gap. So what we came up with this year was I ended up buying a 40-foot Crustbuster 4740 that is set up on 10-inch row spacings, and I drilled our rye into corn stalks with the 10-inch rows, and then when I was out in bean stubble, I just covered every third seed meter, and that gave me 10-inch twin rows with a 20-inch gap in between them. So I used this, and I went back and forth throughout the season between twin rows and 10-inch rows. And I drilled all of our rye like this in 2018. She's definitely a beauty. She's got 31,000 acres on her. So plenty of wear and tear on this thing. And I've currently got it torn apart in the shop, getting a major overhaul. It's definitely needed. So it's not the nicest drill in the world as far as if you're looking to put soybeans in the ground, but as far as a rig to go out and put some rye out in the fall, it gets the job done, and we can get a lot of acres covered in a hurry. So to expand on our twin row cereal rye a little bit, we're mainly using it ahead of corn on our operation, like I said earlier. We have a couple of fields of corn stalks that have twin row rye seeded on it that are going to soybeans for 2019. And this was only possible with this new drill as we were able to straddle the corn stalks with our twin rows with the row configuration of it. So this works great for fields that are new to cover crops, as it kind of gives you a little bit of familiarity as far as having that 20-inch gap in between your rye rows that is similar to just regular no-till, other than you've got the rye next to it pulling moisture out, so it's going to be more fit than a regular no-till field. But it kind of gives you that nice fuzzy feeling in your tummy, you know, that you're not just going out and planting into some monster mat of rye. So this is a good option for strip till operations, as you're already accustomed to laying out strips in the fall using your GPS lines and then planting into that strip in the spring, except, you know, in this situation, it's the opposite. So you're planting in between where your strips are that you put out in the fall, because your strips are your cover crop. And then with the twin row rye, it opens up some flexibility at termination time, just because, you know, your cash crop is going to have a little bit of room to grow on its own before it's directly in contact with the cover crop. And you know, it's not going to be like you don't have to terminate your cover crop. It's just you maybe have a little bit more wiggle room if you get a rain at the bad time or whatever, you know, whatever happens in the planting season. And then this also opens up additional cash crop options such as relay cropping. And in that situation, you would actually not be terminating your cover crop. You would be allowing it go to harvest, and then before harvest, you would be putting in your relay crop, which would be soybeans, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Twin row rye and cover crops, you know, the one negative about it is it's not going to be your best option for erosion control or weed suppression, because you're leaving that gap that's not covered, but it is better than just bare soil with nothing out there anywhere in the field. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this is just showing kind of a row configuration of what I'm trying to do with our twin row rye going to corn. So you can see the twin row rye green streaks, my fancy Microsoft Paint rye plants. You can see those, they're 30 inches apart, about 8 to 10 inches. You know, the 750 drill was about 8 inches, the 8-inch twins, and the new crust buster is 10 inches, obviously. And then we've got a 20 to 22 inch gap in between the individual rye rows where we can plant our cash crop. And then, you know, obviously our cash crops are on 30-inch centers as well. And so to throw another layer into it with our hogs, we're going out and applying our hog manure with a tanker setup, and we're applying that hog manure down the strips in the middle of our rye, or at least we're hoping to. It can be a little bit tricky to get in the right spot, and the tanks can draft quite a bit on side hills, so it's just something that we're trying to do, but when it works out, it's pretty slick. So then here we are. This shows what it looks like with our twin row rye ahead of soybeans for next year, with the twin row rye centered on the old corn stalks, and then we have a 20-inch gap to plant our twin row beans into next year. And, you can, looking at this, you can kind of see how that would open up an option for the relay cropping, as you would come in and plant your soybeans in that cash crop zone while that rye is still fairly small, before it's knee high for sure, and then let everything grow together. So I'll get into some pictures. This is showing the very first time that we ever drilled our twin row rye. So on the left there, you can see the picture of the drill in the field. You can see how we have the row units set up with the gauge wheels facing each other to make a kind of a slender twin, and that was in order to interseed covers into corn with this drill. So yeah, some people have asked me, how do you interseed with the 750? Well, that's how we did it. And then a picture on the right of what that looked like in the fall. And then in 2017, we had an open spring. Jon talked about that a little bit, how we just had a lot of warm weather over the winter and things warmed up really quick in the spring, and the rye was just off to the races. So we had a lot of growth in the spring, and things were kind of getting ahead of us a little bit. And so we went out and we were pretty nervous that the rye was going to get too big. This was going to corn, and we'd never planted into rye, corn planted into rye that was this big. So, you're supposed to go out and terminate it 2 weeks ahead of time. Well, if we would have terminated that, it would have just turned into a big wet mat. So we just went out and planted it, and here's what it looked like after the planter went across it. Everything planted great, but then of course we had a pretty good cold wet snap after we planted our corn into this field, and we ended up having quite a bit of seedling disease in this field. But after it finally was able to get up and running and kind of get over that seedling disease, things took off and ended up being not too shabby, as you can see in these pictures. Okay, so kind of the opposite situation was this last growing season. So in the fall, we drilled this rye on the same date as the previous year, October 3rd. This picture was on November 17th. And then look at this. This was April 20th. So this would have been 5 days after we planted our corn the previous year. And look how small that stuff is. Talk about polar opposites, right? So here we are planting. You can see, we're not set up like Jon is with our Kinsey planter. We've got the spike drill cleaners on the front. They're pin adjust, and then we've got spike closing wheels. So we were doing. I kind of knew better. I figured I should pull my row cleaners up in this field because I didn't think I would need them, but I kept them down. I didn't have them running too aggressive, but it swept the residue off the side, and it looked really good after we came through and planted. And I was like, man, that looks fantastic. Well, then a few days after planting, this came through. You can see the green arrow there. That's showing about where this field's at. So we were somewhere between 2.5 and 3 inches of rain, and that fell in about, I don't know, an hour and a half. It seemed like it was about 10 minutes. It was just raining like crazy. So I went out and was looking at things after that rain came by. You can see it doesn't look too bad from the road. But you can see there's some hills in this field. It's right on the edge of the prairie. You look off in the background on the right, you can kind of see how it flattens off up there. So we get a lot of runoff from up on top on those flat, heavy soils, and then they run down into this field. But we've also got some C and even some D slopes in here and some of these places. So that's what these next pictures are of. These would be some D slopes here. So this is actually part of a termination trial with PFI, so you can see some of the early kill strips and the late kill strips. But as you can see, where we moved that residue out of the seed bed or off of the seed bed, we ended up having a lot of erosion happen right down the corn rows, right where all of our nutrients were from that manure, and we put some nitrogen on with the planter as well. So yeah, I was just completely sick to my stomach when I walked out into this field and saw this, and I knew I messed up by running those row cleaners, and and probably messed up by having the twin rows with no crossways filter strips or anything to kind of stop the water flowing down the rows in this field. So that's definitely a negative. You can see it didn't solve our erosion control problems. Okay, so here we are back up on top of the hill. You can see what that looks like a few days later. The corn's starting to come up. I think that was right around the time that we terminated our late kill strips. Oh, we're skipping ahead. Okay, so here we are in mid-May. So on the left, you can see the early kill strip, and you can see if you look close, there's a whole bunch of little water hemp seedlings coming up. So that just had Roundup to kill the rye. We didn't have any residual down yet. So you can see the water hemp starting to come through. So our rye was no longer suppressing the weeds. But then over on the right, where we had our late kill strips, we also didn't have any residual, just the Roundup to kill the rye. There is no water hemp in that part of the field. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how long that rye's weed suppression capabilities are going to last in your fields after you terminate them. It's going to be excellent at suppressing it while they're still alive, but once you kill it, that weed suppression starts to go out the window pretty quick. So here we are later in June. You can see the corn, it's fairly even. You can still see some of the late kill rye showing up between the rows, but everything's looking pretty good. And then here we are, getting close to canopy. Everything's pretty well evened up. I was really happy with how that all came together. Okay, so did we have any questions about twin row rye? I don't see any. Okay, so if anybody has any, just put them in there in the question box, and we'll get to them at the end. But right now, here we go. Okay, so we'll move into interseeding. So interseeding cover crops is the act of seeding a cover crop into a growing cash crop prior to canopy closure. So we've done this with corn, and what we're trying to do is get something other than cereal rye to grow as a cover crop in our area. We did this with our 750 drill. Some people have done it with a rotary hoe, or you can just broadcast it. But the goal is to get your cover crop root system established enough to survive under the dense canopy later in the season. And that can be easier said than done. It's a pretty good balancing act between your herbicide program and controlling your weeds and getting your cover crop established enough to survive, and then also not having it established too early so you can't kill the weeds that come up before your corn canopies and having everything be too competitive with your corn. So again, like I said, we used our 750 on twins. So this is what it looked like this spring when we were doing it. This was in a corn on corn field. There you can see the row units, like I said before, gauge wheels facing towards each other in between the corn rows. It makes a pretty slender package and keeps things off the corn. If you look over here at the wheel of the drill, that was the most difficult part. The factory, the way the rim came from the factory, that wheel would have been running right down that row of corn. And then so what we did was we went out and found a rim that had the biggest dish on it that we could find, so that the lug holes for that rim are almost equal with the sidewall of the tire. I think there's maybe like a 1-inch offset inside the rim. So that way we were able to push that wheel out as far as we could and straddle four rows of corn with the drill wheels, and we were able to get it through the field. Now this isn't necessarily the best option, as anytime we had a little bit of side draft, you can see how close that wheel's running towards the corn. A little bit of side draft and we're running over corn, and that's not good for anyone. So it's good enough for some experimenting that we're doing in some flat fields, but definitely not something that you want to be using on anything that has much of a side hill at all. So here you can see what things were looking like in June. You can see some cowpeas, some spring peas, some oats coming up in there. There's some more stuff mid-June here. You can see some flax. You can see that the oats are stretching pretty good. They're coming along. So we did have most of our small seeded species ended up getting dinged by our pre-emerge herbicide, which we used 1.5 quarts of Acuron. So that had some Callisto in it and some Dual and some Atrazine. And those residuals, we didn't think it was gonna hit them quite as hard as what it ended up doing, but yeah, it ended up dinging things pretty bad, and all of our initial germination flush of our small seeded stuff got nipped by that residual, and then anything that ended up coming up later after that residual had worn off wasn't really able to get all that established before the corn canopy closed up. So here we are at the end of June. I think this is right around the time we had our field day. So you can see we've got some buckwheat in there, some cowpeas again, some oats. A lot of the, it's pretty much just our large seeded species that we have left in there at that point in time. Okay, so here's just a couple notes on our interseeded corn. Like I said earlier, it's difficult to find the balance between corn yield, cover crop growth, and weed control. There's just so many variables between our herbicide programs, our fertilizer programs, our planting dates, interseeding dates, everything. There's just a lot to manage in that system. But we do have the potential to make great strides with our soils in one season. So in 2017, we put our cover crop out, our interseeded covers out before the corn was even out of the ground. So it was pre-emerge, and then it ended up getting really big. The covers got really big and kind of competed with the corn and whatnot. But we ended up we were running Haney tests every 2 weeks, and we had a 300 pound per acre increase in our phosphorus, which is about a 65 parts per million. And then we also doubled our water extractable organic carbon levels, which is what the microbes in the soil use as their food. That's what they're going after and exchanging nutrients with the plants to get. That's what the microbes want. That's their food. So yeah, like I said, we utilize partial rates of residual herbicides. I wouldn't recommend the 1.5 quarts of Acuron unless you're putting it out, really early, like when you would be putting out a soybean pre in a regular no-till situation, like beginning of April or something. Then it might work. What we have, the first year we tried it, we used about 0.8 pounds of atrazine and 1.5 pounds of acetochlor in our pre-emerge pass, which was right behind the planter, and that ended up working out pretty good. So I think we might try something similar to that again. We might try something similar to that again in 2019. So we also had a field this year that we planted. We had spring seeded cover crops ahead of corn. So then we delayed our corn planting to the end of May. And then we also interseeded that field in the end of June. So we ended up having really good weed control in that field, even though it was interseeded and everything, and we didn't have very many residuals out there. But I think it's just because we changed our status quo management pattern and we were able to knock the weeds back at a different time from what they were used to, and it just changed things up, and it threw the weeds for a loop, and it ended up working pretty good. So here's these soil test results, like I mentioned earlier, with our phosphorus and potassium, and you can see our WEOC levels down there in the bottom left. So the graphs are all Haney tests. So that's using a weak acid instead of a strong acid, like what your standard soil tests are using. So then the top left is an actual standard soil test. So you can see how high some of those phosphorus levels are getting. And that was mostly due to some of the big brassicas that we ended up growing in that interseed field. Okay, so do we have any questions about interseeding? I didn't see anything pop up. We'll keep moving along, but if you have anything, don't be shy to ask. Okay, so what about some outside the box ideas? How can we utilize these precision cover crops to actually create additional revenue streams for our farms instead of just using them as a conservation practice? Well, one option, I guess it's not really a new revenue stream, but an outside the box idea that some people are doing is the bio strip till, where they're seeding rows of cover crops that will winter kill adjacent to rows that will be winter hardy. So you're kind of creating a solid mat in the fall, and then you've got your twin row strip type situation for the spring, or 30-inch cover crops in the spring. And then I've talked about relay cropping a little bit before, where you harvest 2 or more cash crops in 1 year. I think that can be very profitable for guys that are willing to try it. And then, what about going wider than 30-inch rows? We've struggled with interseeding to get the cover crops to survive the summer because the canopy is so dense, and some people, I know some PFI farmers are playing around with 60-inch corn and then interseeding into that, and then you end up having some good cover crop growth for grazing in the fall. And then, I mean, maybe even we go wider than 60 inches, and we start looking at some strip cropping stuff where you go like 15 and 20 foot strips, and maybe you have your 30-inch corn or 30-inch beans in those strips, and then you have a 15 or 20 foot strip of either the opposite corn or beans in the other strip, or maybe you put a full season cover crop to graze down in there, and you mob graze your cattle through those strips, and you kind of open all that canopy back up to your cash crops multiple times a year by running those cattle through there. So here's kind of some pictures of some of that stuff I just talked about. Here's a bio strip till. This was Dustin Mulock. He's up in Canada. You can see the rows of, I assume it's rye, and then he's got some radishes in the other rows. So that's what that can look like in the fall, and then those radishes would be all gone, and it'd just be strips of rye come springtime. And then here's some relay cropping pictures. This is John Coots up in Wisconsin. He's been doing this with wheat and soybeans for a long time, and he's really got it figured out. So he's got twin row rye, or twin row wheat, and then 30-inch beans in between it, and then he's got a 30-foot row crop header for his combine, and he goes through and takes the weed off the top of the beans, and you can see what those look like right after he gets his weed off, and he gets some incredible results from that system. So here's a picture of some 60-inch corn. This is a 60-30 system where you've got 2 rows of corn 30 inches apart, and then a 60-inch row in between them. This is from Cody Nelson up in Minnesota. That's been playing with some of this stuff, and I know he's real big on it, and especially for guys that are grazing cattle and whatnot. So that just kind of shows you how much more growth you can get out of your covers with those 60-inch rows as opposed to your 30-inch rows. You see just how much more light is actually getting down there to that soil surface where you've got your covers growing. And then here's just kind of a picture that would show, something that you could potentially be playing around with those wider strip croppings and whatnot. And I don't really know how that would all work exactly, but it's just something that I thought of. Well, maybe you could, play around with something like that, and it might be able to make it work somehow. So I don't have all the answers, but never short for ideas, and I don't mind throwing them out there. So with that, I know we've got some questions that just popped up, so let's see what those are.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Yeah, it looks like there's a question there for you. If you don't mind going ahead, Tom's asking, what species of cover crop do you typically use for interseeding into the corn?
Yeah, okay. So let me see if I can just pull up. I've got another presentation here that I'll just try and pull up. I don't know if you guys can see all this right now or not, but.
No, we're locked onto your PowerPoint.
Okay.
I mean, we can see, yeah, we can see your
Okay.
PowerPoint program.
I mean, I've done a whole bunch of different stuff. Typically stick with some clovers and some annual ryegrass. That's what I kind of started out with. But then, you know, I've never really had good success getting that stuff to survive. So then Chris Teach out over in Southwest Iowa, over in John's neighborhood, he's been doing a bunch of interseeding stuff as well. So he turned me on to using species such as cowpeas and some mung beans, and looking at some of the warm season legumes that we can be putting into the mix. I like that idea. I've had pretty good luck with those warm season legumes. I've liked the buckwheat. That's done really good. I actually really like the oats as well. They seem to do good. I mean, they're not going to survive through the summer, but they'll get some good growth on, and then they'll end up dying off. So it works pretty good. Can you guys see that?
Yeah, yep, sure
that
can.
popped up? Okay.
Yep, 2018 trial update.
Yep, this shows what I had in my mix for our PFI trial. So annual rye, oats, bunch of clovers, a couple brassicas, and then the cowpeas down there at the bottom. So
cool. Yeah, we definitely have some more time for questions for anybody who's got something that they've been wondering about. Feel free to put it in that Q&A. There's that Q&A icon on your Zoom toolbar that you can click on and ask your questions in there. And John's here for answering questions too. And John, I don't know if you have any comments on that last question or interseeding in general, but feel free to chime in.
Sure. Yeah. Michael, I was wondering when you were talking about your equipment, it's always fascinated me, people that have the ability to modify their equipment like that. I didn't know if you could talk a little bit about what that took time-wise, skills-wise, that type of thing.
Yeah. So the 750, it ended up being pretty simple, really. You know, my dad and grandpa had it already set up on 15-inch rows to drill soybeans with before they started using our planters to put soybeans in. So they had already dropped out every third row unit. I guess to back up a little bit further, the drill was originally a 15-foot drill on 7.5-inch row spacings, and then they widened the drill out to 20 foot back when they were using it for beans again. So that would essentially make it on 10-inch row spacings with that number of row units. And so then they dropped every third row unit out to make it 15s. And they already had the row units on there. You know, if you, let me see if I can't scroll back to the picture where you can kind of see what it looks like. So they already had the row units on there. Well, I guess I'll go back to the rye picture. They already had the row units on there in the configuration that I needed. Like they had it set up like this actually. So you can see how the rows would hug pretty tight next to the bean rows, but the gauge wheels wouldn't be running on the rows. So that's how they had it set up. So all I had to do was just loosen up. There's 4 bolts here on this rock shaft clamp. And then, so I loosened those up and then just put a jack down here underneath the down pressure spring to kind of take a little bit of the weight off of it, because those row units weigh about 200 pounds. And so I put a floor jack on it down there and loosened it up and kind of got it neutralized, and then just, you know, slid it over. But it took a lot of planning to figure out exactly how all that was going to work. You know, I had to go through and find the center of the drill and then say, okay, there's going to be a corn row here, a corn row here, and I want my cover crop row here, and then, you know, try and figure all that stuff out. So, you know, I had a whole bunch of tape marks and Sharpie marks and stuff all over it to get all that stuff laid out. But, you know, that was the gist of it. You know, everything was already, fortunately I had everything already in place, but, you know, all it really needs is just looking at it from, you know, maybe a different perspective, looking at your equipment from a different perspective, and then, you know, just getting the wrenches out and making it happen.
Yeah, and I was going to ask too, just about the specifics on that, Michael. If you had like, yeah, marking, lines with tape on the floor of your shop or chalk or something like that to actually visualize those spacings.
Yeah, I just did everything on the drill frame itself. That way, if I had to move the drill, I had all of my markings with me and whatnot. But yeah, it was. I mean, it was an inexact science, and it ended up working out pretty good. But I guess on the amount of time that it took, when I was having to switch it back and forth from this 15-inch configuration to the twin rows, the last couple of years, I want to say it took me about the first time it probably took me like 12 hours to do it, but the last time I did it, I probably had it done in about 4 because I had it, by the time you about ready to stop doing something, you got it figured out pretty good and how to get it done. So, but it was something that I would try and, if we had a rain delay or something, I'd pull it in the shed and make it happen. So try and find time to do it somewhere.
Yeah, great. So I was going to ask too, it looks like, yeah, we still have more time. So please, folks, put your questions in the chat box. John, I wanted to ask you quick. So Michael had a couple of, outside the box ideas there. And I'm wondering if John, if you have anything in the back of your head that you want to try out in the future, or ideas that you have tinkered with that you didn't cover on tonight that might be interesting for someone to hear a little bit about.
Yeah. Well, we've tinkered with a lot of different things. Really, it's nothing too new, but what we're hoping to do is start raising our own cereal rye seed, which of course would be harvested in July, and then plant a clover or legume mix that would grow during the summer, and then help provide some of the nitrogen for our corn crop the following year. So that's really, like I said, we fiddle around with a lot of different things, but that seems to be what we can pencil out the most immediately, if that makes sense. I know one of the kind of the general wisdom is the best thing you can do to start introducing more diversity into your farm is to start planting a small grain. Obviously, you can start planting your cover crop in the summer then, and when that's the case, you can go to your buffet with no diet restrictions. You can plant just about any cover crop seed that you want and have pretty good success with. So that's kind of the direction we would like to go in the very near future.
Yeah, cool. Have you thought about exactly how much, like the acreage that you'd want to set aside for doing that? Just if you're looking for cereal rye just for your cover crop needs on your farm, or would you be doing as much as you can and selling to neighbors, or what's your
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
right. It would be nice to be able to sell to neighbors, and we actually, excuse me, we do have some small 3,200 bushel grain bins that would be ideal for storing, that is ideal for storing small grains. So obviously, if we're just planting 300 acres of cover crop, we're not going to need 3,000 bushels of, excuse me, 3,000 bushels of cover crop seed. So if we can get neighbors on board, that would be ideal, especially if we can have that cereal rye available in the bin. They come by with their bulk wagon, they fill it up right out of the bin. We wouldn't have to worry about messing around with bulk bags, 50-pound bags, anything like that. It would be, the handling, I think, would be much easier and a lot more efficient.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to hear. So there's a question here in the chat box then. This came up, I think, when Michael was finishing up. Bob's asking, do you see an advantage of implement guidance with these systems in light slopes? And I know Michael talked about dealing with slopes too. So I don't know if either of you have an answer for that or if it's just Michael.
I'll take that one, Bob. I guess I don't have any firsthand experience with the implement guidance systems, where you maybe have a GPS globe on the implement so the system knows exactly where the implement itself is at. But so I can't say exactly how that would work. I assume it works pretty slick once you get it set up right. But I've just made sure that when I'm plugging all of my equipment into my GPS display. We run Green Star, so we have a Starfire 3000 RTK receiver and a John Deere 2630 display. So when I put all of our equipment in, whether it be our tractors or implements or anything, I make sure that all of the measurements that are available in that equipment page, I guess, of the display are accurate. You know, so I want to be telling that GPS system, you know, exactly what's going on as far as what, you know, how long my tongue length is, how tall my tractor is, how wide my implement is, and everything like that. And I've noticed that as I get that stuff more accurate, you know, if I have it in there and I just, you know, guess, I don't take a tape measure out, it's not going to work. It's not going to work right if it's just a guess. But then once I actually take a tape measure out and get all that stuff, you know, really dialed in, it seems like the tractor and the guidance system does a really good job of staying where I want it, whether I'm on a pretty good side slope or not, because I guess I assume, based on that experience, that there's programming in it to tell it, okay, an implement with this long of a tongue is going to draft, you know, this far on a 6% side slope, and so on and so forth. And it's ended up working pretty good. You know, you look at the picture on the slide that I have pulled up right now, you can see off there on the right, there's some pretty good slopes. There's some C and D slopes on that stuff. And I've been amazed at how good our guidance systems are able to handle it once I get all that stuff plugged in correctly. So that's all I have for that one.
All right. Well, yeah, it looks like we've exhausted all the questions in the chat box. I'm surprised that that we don't have any more questions here. People are taking a kind of a chill night tonight, or maybe our speakers were just so thorough. There really was a ton of good detail in these presentations, though. So maybe I guess this is the time to wrap up, unless John or Michael have any you know, parting thoughts or questions or anything else to add.
I do not. It's been a pleasure sharing the information tonight.
Ditto. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming out.
Cool. Yeah, John and Michael, we really appreciate you taking the time to share with us. And anybody else can look to the Practical Farmers of Iowa website for some research reports that these guys are involved with, and other cooperators at the on-farm research projects that PFI is doing. So look for more information there. And thanks a lot, John and Michael, again, for taking the time to do this. And thanks everybody for tuning in tonight.